Oh, I think that's on now. So I've been here like for 4 full days now, doing my thing up here, told all my friends, hundreds of folks, hey, you got to go to citizenshearing.org, you got to do the live stream and all that. And I was here late Tuesday night, just working on the online class that I teach. Stan Friedman said, will you introduce me? So I introduced him. That's the only thing any of my friends have noticed that I've done here, like in the whole 4 days. Oh, I saw you introduce Stan. So,
don't mention his name while I'm on stage.
I know, I thought I would do that too. 2 of the premier researchers into Roswell, and they don't necessarily agree on anything, or everything anyway. That's what I meant to say. I'm really tired, can you tell? I got Danny Sheehan for a roommate, and 2 things, I'm up talking theology till 3 in the morning, and he has apnea and snores like an 1800 steam engine. So, between the 2, Danny's great. All right, here we go. I'm pleased to introduce Eric Helm, Steve McKenzie, and Kevin Randle, the authors of over 100 books. This guy doesn't just write about Roswell. He's got 80 science fiction books, something like that, 90?
No, not 80 science fiction, but...
military, adventure, science fiction, great stuff. You really want to go buy one of each of them. Get them all autographed here before you leave. This gentleman is an American hero. He served in both Vietnam and in the Second Gulf War. And absolutely, a mild round of applause. Standing ovation will come after his presentation, right, guys? He flies helicopters. I don't fly helicopters. Anybody else in here fly a helicopter? I can't imagine how you learn to do that. He was a public affairs officer. He was a general's aide. And he was a real honest-to-God intelligence officer. He's the John Alexander of Roswell. That should have got a laugh. Anyhow, and he got the Combat Action Badge in Iraq. I got a bachelor's, an MBA, and a PhD. He has 1 more degree than that. He has a bachelor's, 2 master's degrees, and the PhD. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Randle.
I thought he was just going to say, here's Kevin Randle. He'll be talking tonight. If we could have a slide. See if that'll work now. Yeah. And we didn't get the full effect. Well, I'm going to be the 3rd one talking about Roswell. So you've heard Stan's version of it. You've heard Don's version of it. Now you'll hear my version of it. I'm going to do something a little bit different because I'm going to try to talk about some of the claims the debunkers make and how they're not really quite valid. So we know this whole thing began with the headline, the Roswell Army Airfield captured a flying saucer in the Roswell region. This is critical because there's been a lot of people saying about Jesse Marcel. Jesse Marcel said when he came home, he told his son it was a flying saucer, and they said, well, they didn't use that term in 1947. Here's a 1947 newspaper where they used the term flying saucer, and it was the Roswell Daily Record. So for a little bit of time, not long, there was this idea that a flying saucer had been captured. Next slide, because I forgot to say that. See, I forgot to say that. And we'll go to the next one, too, while we're at it. So after 3 hours, the disk mystery is solved because they've taken debris from Roswell to Fort Worth. General Roger Ramey takes a look at this stuff and declares it all a weather balloon. Next slide, please. Jesse Marcel was the intelligence officer, as we all know, at Roswell in 1947. He was the one that went out and picked up the debris. He was the one that took it to Fort Worth took it to Fort Worth so General Ramey could see what it was, and he was the one that photographed with it, as was Ramey and DuBose later on. But they're talking about this as a weather balloon. Now, some time ago, there was a book published, and they said this is the real stuff. This is the real debris. It's clearly the weather balloon. It's clearly a torn-up weather balloon. And I asked Jesse Jr. about this one day, and he said that wasn't the stuff his father brought home. I also talked to a reporter named Johnny Mann. And he'd taken Marcel out to the desert in the 1990s to interview him about what they had seen, what they had found. And he found the pictures in the book and looked at it, and he said, Jess, I got to tell you, that looks like a weather balloon. And Jesse said to him, yeah, but that's not the stuff I brought to Fort Worth. That stuff was switched. And we know that it was switched based on testimony from others. Next slide, please. We have General Ramey wearing his cap, and Don asked me about this earlier, why he had his hat on. I don't have a clue why he would have his hat on in this, but you can see clearly all of the debris on the floor. You see Irving Newton, who was a weather officer in Roswell, and he was brought in at the general's order. He was told to come on over there. He said he couldn't leave the office because he was the only one there, and he was told, well, you better get your ass over here because the general wants to see you, and if you don't have a car, take the first one with the keys in it. So they wanted him to get over there very quickly. And that was so that they could come up with this balloon explanation. Next slide, please. And what's critical here is here's the Alamogordo News from July 10th, and they're again explaining the weather balloon phenomenon. You'll see that it's got the weather balloons. There's a fellow up on a ladder here which you can barely see, but that ladder was bought by Charles Moore, and that'll become important a little bit later. But what they've done here is they've shown a weather balloon launch, or a launch of a cluster of balloons, and this is what supposedly fell at Roswell, and this may be what is causing the flying saucers. Next slide, please. There you get a better shot of the guy on the ladder and launching the weather balloons from the newspaper. Next slide. And this is what the array looks like laid out there. And this is what we call the Alamogordo solution, simply because these balloons were launched from the Alamogordo area. And that was why the people in Roswell may not have known what it was. Next slide, please. Charles Moore was an engineer or a scientist working in Alamogordo in 1947 with what was called Project Mogul. This is the explanation that the Air Force offered in 1995. If you remember, in 1947, we saw the pictures of the weather balloon stuff, and that's what they said it was. Well, don't worry about it, it's a weather balloon. Then in the mid-1990s, they reinvestigated Roswell. They said, well, we lied in 1947, it wasn't a weather balloon, it was a weather balloon. They just attached a new name to it. It was Project Mogul, this highly classified event that was going on in New Mexico, and that's why everybody didn't know with it. And as Charles Moore was one of the engineers on that project. Next slide, please. So what Moore was saying in the mid-1990s is that Project Mogul was highly classified. Nobody knew the name of it, nobody knew what was going on. He said that the Roswell debris came from flight number 4. They had been launching a series of flights. The first 3 were done in New Jersey. They moved all their equipment to New Mexico, and then they began launching these arrays of balloons. And what they were attempting to do was create a constant level balloon that would be trapped in the acoustical level that they postulated in the atmosphere, like the acoustical level that you find in the ocean. And if they could get a balloon that stay in that acoustical level, if the Soviets detonated an atomic bomb, they would pick up the sound of that detonation. So what they were attempting to do was create this constant level balloon and make sure that it could detect explosions on the ground. So they were detonating stuff in the White Sands area as well. And they had winds aloft data that showed the flight of the balloon, so they could prove what was Project Mogul. Charles Moore had calculated this based on the winds aloft data and all of this. Next slide, please. Well, the first thing we have to know is that the purpose of Mogul was classified, but the experiments in New Mexico were not. The flights and experiments in New Mexico were of the off-the-shelf equipment. They weren't doing anything to keep it quiet. In fact, the fellows in Alamogordo, the scientists there, had gone to Roswell to request their assistance in tracking their balloons. The FAA required that they make notifications of the flights, NOTAMs. You've got a 600-foot-long balloon array floating through the atmosphere. This could clearly be a hazard to aerial navigation. So they were required to file NOTAMs. This is how classified it was. They're announcing it throughout the Southwest that these things are going to be flying. And as I said, Charles Moore had gone to the Roswell Army Airfield to ask for help in doing this. So we know that it was supposedly highly classified. Moore said it was so highly classified, he didn't even know the name of it. He didn't know people on the project didn't know the name of Project Mogul. Next slide, please. This is from Dr. Albert Crary's diary. Dr. Albert Crary was the leader of Project Mogul in New Mexico. This is published in the Air Force Explanation. And what you see there is Crary clearly using the name Mogul in two separate locations. They knew the name. Moore may have forgotten the name. So he's telling the story. It was so highly classified we didn't know the name. We can prove that Moore knew it. Now, a number of years ago, I'd gotten into a bit of an argument with Jim Mosley, who wrote did a newsletter called Saucer Smear. And he was always going after Jesse Marcel for being a liar, because some of what Jesse Marcel said in an interview with Bob Pratt didn't track precisely with the documentation we could find. I always thought it wasn't that big a deal. In one example that is just absolutely hilarious, if you insert a comma into what Jesse Marcel said, it changes the entire meaning. And what happened was Marcel was talking about how during World War II he was in an aircraft that was shot down. And Bob Pratt said, did everybody survive? And he said, all but one fell into a mountain. Well, that means that all but he and another fellow survived because they had all crash landed in a mountain. But if you put a comma in there, it's all of them survived except the one guy who flew into the mountain. So you've got these kind of problems. And I suggested that if Mosley was going to castigate Jesse Marcel for lying, meaning we did not understand the interpretation, then shouldn't we do the same thing for Charles Moore, because we'd clearly caught him in a lie. He knew the name of Mogul. It was out there for all them to see. Mosley, of course, took great offense at this and said that he wasn't going to do it, and took me off the list of Saucer Smear. I was thrown off the subscribers list. But later on, he put me back on, so I was delighted. Next slide, please. So as I said, they claimed that the debris was flight number 4. But Dr. Albert Crary's diary, which was published by the Air Force, said that flight number 4 had been canceled. There had been clouds in the morning, and the missile launch that they were going to use the balloons with and in conjunction with had been canceled, so they canceled the flight. Moore had told me in the 1990s that when a flight was canceled, what they did was they stripped all the equipment off the array, but they let the balloons go because they couldn't take the helium out of the balloons. They couldn't put it back in the bottles. Excuse me. For some reason, I can speak endlessly with no problems, and of course I get up here and I can't speak at all. So we have Dr. Crary's diary saying that the flight was canceled. There is no official record for the flight. The New York University, which was responsible for these balloon flights, had a list of all the flights. There's no flight number 4. It goes from 3 to 5. 5 is the first official flight in New Mexico. You can make a case based on another ambiguous statement in Crary's diary that they did some kind of flight that day, but it was not an official flight. What is interesting about that is Moore had told me about them having to be told to the FAA for the NOTAMs. Moore in a 1995 letter said, we didn't file a NOTAM on flight number 4 because we didn't expect it to get off the restricted area over the White Sands Missile Range. This tells you one of two things. They weren't doing a real flight, if they in fact did one, but more importantly, Moore was afraid that if we could find an archive with the NOTAMs in it, we'd find that there was no notification for flight number 4, so he's trying to cover his bases in that respect. Unfortunately, and before you ask, there is no archive of NOTAMs. I spent a year trying to find them, and was eventually told they didn't save them. And NOTAMs are really just routine stuff, such as which runways are closed for repairs, something going on in the airport that might involve aerial traffic, something like that. They're just little notes, and that when they expire, they throw them away. Now, next slide, please. Moore put together what he thought was the path flight number 4 would have taken based on the weather data that was available. This is what the winds aloft data looked like for that period in 1947. They issued them on a 4-hour or 3-hour period so that the winds aloft would be current. The winds at the surface may be blowing one direction. You get up 5,000 feet or 10,000 feet, they can be blowing in the opposite direction. So when somebody tells me, well, it wasn't a balloon because the wind was blowing the wrong way, I'm thinking, do you have any idea what the winds aloft were? So it could have been seeming to go into the wind. You'll notice that the data are incomplete. Some stations didn't report on a regular basis. Some stations didn't report for whatever reason. And these data only go up to 20,000 feet, but the mogul balloons were supposed to fly at 45, 50, 60, 70, 80,000 feet. There is no way that you can take the winds aloft data from 1947 based on these charts and figure out what's going on 80,000 feet above the surface of the Earth. Now, Moore, in his first report, had said, he thanked me for sending him the winds aloft data. We had talked about this, and he said, well, do you have the charts? And I said, yes, and I sent him a whole bunch of them. And he sent me another letter, and he says, well, that's good. Could you send me the charts for these dates? And I said, yes, I could. When you get to his book, my name is dropped out completely, which doesn't bother me in the least. But he said, when people would ask him about that, I said, well, I got the winds aloft data myself. I didn't need Kevin Randle. Here's a letter from Moore, or I'm sorry, next slide. I thought I'd called that. Here's a letter from Moore to me saying thanks for the data. So we can prove that he had actually used our winds aloft data, or my winds aloft data, when he put together the solution. And he's absolutely right. Anybody could have gone to NOAA and asked for the winds aloft data and gotten it, but he didn't do so. So what we have is Project Mogul not really being a viable answer. It is in essence a weather balloon. The guys at Roswell knew they were flying these things, would have recognized them as weather balloons. There was nothing special about them other than they were tethered together in this 600-foot long string. Now, if I can recognize a weather balloon, if you tie a whole bunch of them together on a big long piece of string, don't you think I'm going to be able to recognize it when I see it on the ground? Next slide, please. Hey, it worked. Did you see that fancy dissolve there? Thought I'd talk a little bit about our trips to Roswell, and this is one of my favorite photographs of Don standing by the sign in the rest area, watch for rattlesnakes. I'm wondering, how much rest are you going to get if you're watching for a rattlesnake? But we started our investigation in February of, actually we started it earlier that. We went to Roswell for the first time in February of 1989. Don was working on putting together an investigation. We met at a science fiction convention when we debated science fiction writers about the reality of UFOs. And he asked me, because of my military background, if I'd assist in their investigation, because they thought someone with a military background might, relate to the people better, and they might understand the terminology and the lingo of the military better than a civilian who'd never been involved with it. So we teamed up to go down to Roswell in 1989. Next slide, please. The man who really started this, although there's lots of people who claim to be the beginning of it, was Mac Brazel. And he was a rancher, an old-time cowboy, as he was described by his son. And he was out on the ranch with a couple of the neighbor boys. They came across this huge field of metallic debris. The sheep wouldn't cross it. He wanted to know who was going to clean up the mess, because it was something just more than a weather balloon. That was what concerned him, not that this debris was there, but who's going to clean up this mess? And his neighbors suggested that since it was something that obviously came from the air, maybe you ought to talk to the guys at the air base. I'm surprised he went to Roswell, simply because you would think he might have gone to Alamogordo or Albuquerque, but he went into Roswell, and it may be just the way the things worked in that region. Next slide, please. So you get a look at what Mac W.W. Brazel looked like as his old-time cowboy. He passed away in 1963 without really telling anything about this, except mentioning some things to his son. He once complained about being held in jail down in Roswell, and he had told his son that he couldn't really talk about what he had seen because he'd told him he wouldn't talk about it. And I've always felt in this case, Brazel hadn't been threatened. He was simply asked to keep it quiet. And Bill had suggested that his father was such a guy that if you asked him something like that and he gave his word that he wouldn't talk about it, he wouldn't talk about it. So even to family members, Mac Brazel never really talked about it. And here's a guy that's kind of key to this whole thing. We never had an opportunity to talk to him about it. We get what he said from family members and what he was like from family members, but we really don't get his take on the whole thing other than a few bits and pieces. Next slide, please. So in 1989, Don and I went down to Roswell to investigate the case. We ended up in Albuquerque. We were going to meet with some people who might know something about it, and they turned out to be really New Age oriented and didn't know much about UFOs and didn't care much about UFOs and weren't much help to us either. We were going to meet with Frank Joyce, but he was sick that weekend, and he said, well, I really can't meet with you guys. And I'm thinking at this point, this is really blowing up in our face. We go down to Roswell, we talk to Cliff Stone, who supposedly knows something. Cliff Stone begins to lecture us on UFOs, telling us all kinds of things about UFOs that we A, either already knew, or B, really didn't care about. We were concentrating on Roswell, and he's going off about the Chilean Air Force chasing UFOs and all of this other ancillary stuff. But he said one thing that was kind of interesting. He said that the debris field where Mac found this thing was out by 2 twin windmills. And I think, well, here's a heck of a clue. How many twin windmills can there be in New Mexico? And the answer is about 8 billion. Every time you turned around, there was a twin windmill. And not only that, there was some triple windmills, quadruple windmills. It was just unreal. So we're spending our time in Roswell. We're getting nowhere. It's now Sunday. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to go meet Bill Brazel in Carrizozo, New Mexico. This is Bill Brazel in 1989. And Bill sits down and we chat for a minute with him, and he finally says to us, my dad found this thing, and now we're off and running. But the point is, Bill had told his wife, and he later told us, that if he kind of liked us, he'd help us out, and if he didn't, well, he'd just kind of blow us off. So we lucked out. We convinced him we were nice people. We weren't going to make fun of him, even though he was an old-time cowboy too. And Bill Brazel told me one story that I just think was great. But there's actually two. One is his cousin, Wayne Brazel, is the guy who killed Pat Garrett. Pat Garrett is the guy who killed Billy the Kid. And they got into a big argument over ranch land in New Mexico, and Garrett was going to buy the land, but he was supposed to buy Brazel's sheep, and Garrett apparently gave him a short count on it, so there was all kinds of animosity there, and they're riding into Las Cruces, and Wayne Brazel gunned him down. He was tried and acquitted. And I've read a couple of books about the Lincoln County Wars and what's going on in Lincoln County, and these historians are always saying, well, we don't know what happened to Wayne Brazel. So we're riding out with Bill Brazel. Next slide, please. We're riding out with Bill Brazel in his pickup truck. And I said, do you know what happened to Wayne? He says, oh, yeah, I moved to Arizona. He said, my dad and I used to go over and visit him. So you get all this stuff about, well, he went to South America, he was killed by bandits down there and all this nonsense. And none of these brilliant historians ever thought to call New Mexico and talk to the Brazel family and say, what happened to Wayne? Well, he moved to Arizona. So this is probably one of the only pictures, and I took both of them, of Bill Brazel on the debris field. So people say to us, well, you guys got the wrong place. You didn't know where it was. Here's Bill Brazel basically saying, this is it. I found some of the debris right here. So we're pretty sure we got the right place. And as we're going out to the ranch in his pickup truck at 8 o'clock in the morning, and Bill's driving, and he says, you boys want a beer? And I'm thinking, not really. And Don, of course, being a teetotaler, says, not at all. And Bill pops one open, and he's sucking it down. And I thought, well, to be neighborly, I ought to drink one with him. So I'm drinking warm beer at 8 o'clock in the morning, and I really don't care for beer that much either. But Bill takes us out to the debris field, and so we know where it is. And he described what he had seen. He described where he'd picked up the debris and that sort of thing. Next slide, please. And that's where he took us, to that very place. My computer here is not working. This, from the hill up there, down through there is where the gouge was that they talk about in some of the books. Bill Brazel talked about the gouge through the area, that it looked like it had hit at one end, it widened out, and then it narrowed again as if the thing had bounced out of the field and the debris was scattered around like that. And he told us exactly where it was. Now, sometime later, Don and I took a scientific expedition out there, the first archaeological expedition out there, and the landscape seemed to have changed from the time we'd been there before until the time we got back. And we thought, well, we're on the right place, we think. And one of the things they did was they put all these flags, archaeological flags, down where we thought the gouge was, measuring it out 3/4 of a mile, and then we dug test holes all around looking for debris or any samples of it. And once we were done, we picked all that stuff up and we left. Sometime later, we took Bud Payne, who was a judge in Carrizosa, who had seen the military attempt to clean up the debris field out there. And he took us out to where he remembered the gouge was and the debris where the debris was. And as I was getting out of the pickup truck, I looked down and there's one of the flags. We were inside the same 3/4 mile stretch. We'd missed one of them as we picked them up, but he'd put us on the same stretch of land and said it goes that way. And so we're very confident that we found the right place. But this debris field was just metallic debris. It didn't seem to have the variety of materials you would expect in some kind of an aviation accident. It was just limited to a number of things. Bill Brazel talked about the foil that you could wad up. He talked about a piece of light wood-like material that was about the size of his hand. He said he tried to get a sliver off it with his pocket knife, and he said he used his pocket knife to cut barbed wire, so it was pretty sharp, and he wanted to get a sliver to see if there was any stratification there, and he couldn't even raise a sliver off it, and he said it was had the same density of balsa wood. So you hear people talk, well, these mogul balloons had balsa wood in them, and they're talking about finding balsa wood. No, they're not talking about finding balsa wood. They're talking about something that has like the density of balsa wood, but it's much stronger. He couldn't break it. And then he talked about what he called monofilament fishing line. And he said if you shine a light in one end, it would come out the other. Well, that's obviously fiber optics, which they didn't have in 1947. But in our archaeological expedition and the others that have gone out there, I know Don was involved in some of those, and ours was sort of a site survey, which means we were just kind of testing the area and looking for things, and they went out later on with much more detailed attempts to recover some of the debris. But we were told that the military had gone out there and cleaned the whole thing up. Next slide, please. And there they are, cleaning it up. Unfortunately, this photograph was taken in Arizona, and it's for the movie Roswell, but it gives you an idea of what's going on. The military standing there shoulder to shoulder, and they're going to move across this field, picking up all little slivers of this material that they can find. And they went back and forth a number of times, loading it in the back of a truck. So when we go out there and look for the debris, there was really very little chance we'd find it. Now, people always say, well, did you try a metal detector? And I always say, gee, I wish I'd thought of that. But of course we did. We also know that there's a lot of burrowing animals out there, like pack rats, which will take little shiny things back to their burrow and leave a nut or something in its place. So we looked in burrows. We looked at the root systems of plants that looked like they were old enough to have been there in 1947. The only thing we ever found in there was a dead scorpion, which I wasn't delighted with. But we've tried all of those sorts of things on the debris field repeatedly and not had any good luck with that so far. So once we got to Bill Brazel, I realized, and I think Don realized, that there's more to this story than just these bizarre little tales told by some people or some wackos in Albuquerque. And we realized we'd have to come back. Well, on our next trip, we met a fellow named Walter Hott. Next slide, please. Walter was the public affairs officer in Roswell in 1947. He was also assigned to a flight crew. And when Joseph did my introduction, he mentioned that I'd been a PIO. That had been one of my additional duties. In fact, in Iraq, I did an awful lot of stories for the local newspapers from the Midwest, where our National Guard unit had been deployed from, about what our soldiers were doing and that sort of thing. So that was my additional duty as a intelligence officer. When I was done doing the intelligence stuff, I was doing the PAO stuff, or PIO stuff, which was kind of fun because the XO said to me one day, how long does it take you to write a story? And I said, I don't know. How long does it take? takes as long as it takes. You know, some stories just sort of flow out of your fingertips, and some of them you struggle with for hours and hours and hours. So Walter Haut's the PAO. He wrote the press release. Now, he was never clear whether he had written the press release or Colonel Blanchard, his boss, had dictated it over the phone. Whatever it was, he was the guy that took it around to the media outlets in Roswell and said they had found a flying saucer. So you get a picture of him in his house speaking on the phone, picture of him when he was a lieutenant, and a picture of him on the set of Roswell, which was the Showtime movie about this whole event. Now Walter was always very clear. He had never seen the bodies. He hadn't seen anything. All he did was write the press release. Then around 2000, he began to talk about how he had actually seen some of the bodies, and he'd seen a lot more than he had let on. And Don and Tom Carey and Julie Schuessler put together an affidavit for Walter to sign about what he'd actually seen. And he talked about seeing a body. He talked about the craft and that sort of thing in the affidavit. And the skeptics come out and said, well, gee whiz, he's sure changing his story now, isn't he? And the answer is, yeah, he is. I can understand it, why he might have done that. He saved himself a lot of grief by saying, I just wrote the press release. But there's really an interesting twist to this. Next slide, please. Richard Harris was a finance officer in Roswell in 1947. He was working with Patrick Saunders and all of this stuff to account for the monies. When you do anything in the military, you have to pay for it. It's got to be accounted for, and there's all kinds of funds you draw from. If you're doing training flights, it comes from the training budget. If you're doing something else, it comes from this other budget. It's all got to be accounted for. Now, if you say, well, we're doing a training cross-country flight from Roswell to Wright Field, that's a legitimate expenditure, and if you happen to load a bunch of alien bodies on the airplane that takes them to Wright Field, you've got a training flight that covers the expenditure, and nobody can ask questions. It's all documented and well hidden. Something that people don't know. So Harris was involved in some of that. And you can see Harris in his lieutenant's uniform when he was in Roswell, and that was him in Albuquerque in the mid-1990s. And I say in the mid-1990s because this is critical. So Harris is telling me that he had an opportunity to see the bodies. Well, he was in a hangar, and Walter was there, and Walter says, you want to see something really strange, really unusual about the bodies, and told him what was going on, and Harris, he says, you just go through this door, and Harris put his hand on the doorknob, and he decided not to go in. I'm thinking, I'd have gone through the door. I'd have been through there so fast you wouldn't believe it. But Harris, he didn't want to see this, so he didn't do it. The point is, here is Harris telling me, in the mid-1990s, Walter Haut knew about bodies and that sort of thing before Walter Haut ever began to confirm it. So what this sort of does is confirm the importance of the affidavit, because Harris said that Walter had seen the bodies and didn't realize what Walter was saying. Next slide, please. Now, Colonel Blanchard's staff, we need to talk about. This is Colonel Blanchard in his colonel uniform and later on as a four-star general. Blanchard was one of the stars of the Air Force. People will say, well, you know, they made this press release. Blanchard was a loose cannon. You couldn't trust what he said and what he did. If Blanchard had been a loose cannon, he would have stopped at colonel. There's no way he'd have gone beyond that, yet he ended up with 4 stars, and he was the vice chief of staff. Had he not died of a heart attack in the Pentagon, he would have been the next chief of staff. So Blanchard was anything but a loose cannon. He was a solid officer. This is Colonel Blanchard's staff. Next slide, please. Jesse Marcel, there's Patrick Saunders, and a number of other people on the staff. Every member of Colonel Blanchard's staff that we talked to, that we could find, said this was alien. It was extraterrestrial, with one exception. And this was a fellow named Barrowclaw, who was, I can't remember whether he was the exec or the deputy commander, but either way, Barrowclaw is the only one that said no, it didn't happen. But every other member that we talked to said yes. Next slide, please. Patrick Saunders was the base adjutant in 1947. He was the guy that was working, actually the finance officer, Harris, was working for him. Patrick Saunders, when I talked to him on the telephone, made jokes about little green men and all of this sort of thing. He didn't really want to get involved with an interview over the telephone and that sort of thing. Next slide, please. But here's what he did. Don and I had written, actually we wrote 2 books, UFO Crash at Roswell and The Truth About UFO Crash at Roswell. And everybody says, well, why would you call it The Truth of UFO Crash at Roswell? And I'm thinking, because the Roswell movie was about to come out, and it would be relating to the UFO crash at Roswell. So I wanted the title UFO Crash at Roswell on the second book, so that if people wanted to help us make our extra 17 cents per copy of books sold, that was our royalty, that they would know what to look for. But so Saunders put together, from the flyleaf of both books, you can see on one of them he says, here's the truth, and I still haven't told anybody anything. It's on the page called Damage Control. He signs his name Pat, and he says files were altered, so were personal records, along with assignments and various codings and code words. He changed serial numbers around. It's telling what they had done to hide all of this stuff. And on the second one, this is Saunders sending it to his daughter, and just says, you were there, love, Dad. But you know, he's saying this is what's going on. So Patrick Saunders is telling everybody in this respect, in the documenting, that what we've said in the books is basically true. So Saunders also sent a letter to his daughter, which I have a copy of, and he talks about how they sure covered this thing up, how they sure buried it, how they destroyed the paper trail, which is what their job was to do. If somebody comes back later on and tries to follow the paper trail, they're not going to be able to follow it, which of course we found out because there was no paper trail for us to follow. Next slide, please. Colonel Edwin Easley was the base provost marshal. I may be the only one who've talked to him at any length. First time I called Easley, he was very hesitant to talk on the phone, but very polite. I mean, he's not one of these people to hang up on you. Very polite. When I'd ask him a question, he said, well, I'm sorry, I can't tell you. I was sworn to secrecy. I can't talk about it. I can't talk about it. He finally became annoyed, and he said to me, I can't talk about it. I told you that. I promised the president I wouldn't talk about it. Well, the skeptics say, would the president be calling an obscure major? And I'm thinking, I remember a president talking to an obscure lieutenant colonel, and the next thing you know, Jimmy Doolittle's dropping bombs on Tokyo. So the point is, if it's important enough, it doesn't matter the rank of the soldier he's talking to, it's what the guy knows. Now, we never were able to figure out whether Easley actually promised Truman himself personally, or it's Truman's representative he promised. But the point really is, if you've promised the representative, you're not going to talk about, you've in essence mentioned the president. I actually asked Easley once, if I could find a general officer who would absolve you of your oath, would you talk about it? And that's when he said, you know, we couldn't get above the president on that. Next slide, please. So there's a number of generals who were involved in this. This is Arthur Exon. In Exxon, I called, and I didn't really want to tell him what I was searching for, because I didn't want to get accused of contaminating the witness. So I was talking to him about Project Blue Book and what was going on with Project Blue Book. And he told us, actually, and something that didn't come out, was that in the 1960s he would get a call from Washington, D.C., because he was the base commander at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And when you think of the base commander, think of the mayor of a city. That's what the base commander is. And in fact, in the Army, they now call it the mayor's cell. The guys that take care of the facilities and all of that kind of stuff. So he was the base commander, but he'd get a phone call and he'd say, we need an airplane. And the guys would come in on commercial flights to Wright Field, get on an Air Force airplane, go out to investigate some kind of a UFO incident, then fly back into Wright Field, and then get on commercial flights to go back to their bases. Well, that way you can't track where they came from or any of that sort of thing. But Exxon was very clear about that. Exxon finally starts talking about the Roswell case. And what we learned from him is that although he didn't see the stuff personally, he knew the guys who were involved with it. And they would tell him, yeah, we don't know what this stuff is. Talk to him about the bodies. He said he knew some of the people that photographed that residue from Roswell. I mean, this is in our first conversation. Don, and then later Tom Carey and Don interviewed him frequently about what he saw and what he knew. He talked about a committee. He called them the Unholy 13, who oversaw all of this stuff and gave us the names of some of the people who were involved in it, which don't, I mean, some of it responds to or corresponds to MJ-12, but not all of it. But Exxon wasn't confirming MJ-12, he was just saying there was this oversight committee. I know that some people believe MJ-12 is real. Some of us believe it's still very controversial. So Exxon's testimony really doesn't corroborate MJ-12, but it corroborates the committee. Next slide, please. This is Thomas DuBose. You'd seen him earlier in a photograph. This is him with Don Schmidt, because for some reason, when Don goes out on an investigation with me or with Tom Carey, Tom and I are always taking the pictures. So we have lots of pictures of Don on the investigation, but Tom and I have no pictures of us doing the investigations because we're always doing the photographing. But DuBose was in Ramey's office. I mean, we saw him in there with the balloons. And he said, that residue on the floor, that's not what came from Roswell. They switched that stuff. And so here's a general officer who's telling us that the balloon explanation was a put-on job done to get the reporters off General Ramey's back. He also said that he was in charge of the base because Ramey was off that day or was somewhere else, so he was in essence in command. General Clements McMullen, who was the deputy commander of Strategic Air Command in 1947, called him and wanted him to get some of that stuff brought to Washington, D.C. So he talks about the courier flight from Roswell to Fort Worth, how they hand carried it from the airplane from Roswell to the airplane for Fort Worth, and the guys take off. I believe it was Colonel Al Clark who took it to Washington, D.C. so they could see it. So DuBose confirms all of this stuff, that the residue was changed, there's something really unusual going on. There was a lot of interest from Washington, D.C., which there wouldn't have been for a weather balloon. In fact, next slide, please. I was talking about how we can see him in the office. The guy without the hat is Thomas DuBose. So he's sitting there looking at it. So he knows what's going on there as well. Next slide, please. Now, before you get excited, this is not a picture of the alien. This is actually from the movie Roswell, and it's on display in the museum in Roswell. And what cracks me up is, if you remember Bob Guccione from Penthouse Magazine, he's making a big deal how he's got the authentic pictures of the Roswell alien, and they're going to publish them in their magazine. And I understand he paid $200,000 for them. I'd have sold him a picture for $2.50. But the alien in his pictures in his magazine is that exact mock-up from the movie Roswell. You can match up the wounds on the head with the pictures in the Penthouse magazine. So Guccione, that may explain why Penthouse isn't being published anymore. Next slide, please. One of the first people to talk about the alien bodies was Sergeant Melvin Brown. He, I guess, immigrated to England and stayed there after his military service. And he told his family a little bit about what he had seen and what he had done in the military. So you can see a picture of him in the yearbook, and you can see a picture of him later in life as he moved on. Next slide, please. These are members of his family, his wife, Ada Brown, daughter Beverly Bean, who gave a lot of information to us, and his other daughter. Now, Beverly Bean tells us that when they were landing on the moon, her father made some comment about flying saucers being real. Harriet tells us that she had run home one day for some reason and slammed the door, and was talking about a flying saucer, and he said, yeah, they're real, because he had seen the bodies, and he told his wife a little bit about it. The skeptics will tell you that Beverly Bean's tale of seeing the bodies and what her father said was not corroborated by the other family members. That's simply not true. Both are on the record, both are on videotape. In fact, these photographs were taken off the videotape, which really stuns me that I can actually take pictures off my television now and get fairly good quality things like that. But the family did corroborate that Brown had seen the bodies. He said he was out there. They'd come through the base and said, looking for volunteers, you, and you, come with us. And he was taken out there and had an opportunity as they were riding back to Roswell in one of the trucks. They weren't supposed to look under tarp, and of course, Brown did. Again, unlike Harris, who didn't want to open the door and had permission to do so, Brown was told not to look, and he did. So I'm wondering if Walter had said to Harris, don't open that door, if he might have done it. This is, oh, I'm sorry, next slide, please. The slides come up on my computer here. Thomas Gonzalez, he walked into the second museum in Roswell. At one point they were competing, Roswell UFO museums, and he walked into the one run by John Price when Don Ecker happened to be there, and he talked about how he'd seen the bodies. Told the story about, again, like Brown, he had been volunteered to go out and help guard the area. I read Don Ecker's piece on that and how he'd seen the bodies. I called Gonzalez, and I really had just one question for him, and it was to corroborate what Don Ecker had written in the magazine, which Gonzalez did. But one thing that Gonzalez did, unlike everybody else, next slide please, he made carvings of the bodies. These are his carvings. He took a picture of them, or Don Ecker took a picture of them. Somebody took a picture of them, and this is what he thought the aliens looked like. Obviously, he was no artist. But we have something from one of the guys who was there involved with the bodies, who did something prior to all of this stuff going on. Later on, he came forward and he said, yes, I was there and I saw that stuff. But he's the one that made, took the pictures or carved these things. Next slide, please. This obviously is Charlene Green. Unlike Melvin Brown, we've got a lot of color going on here. Her father was assigned to the base at Roswell. Next slide, please. Homer Rowlett. He too happened to see the bodies. He too didn't share a lot with the family, but he did tell them a little bit about what he'd seen, especially after he'd become ill. So we have a wide variety of witnesses who saw the bodies, who talked to family members, who talked to some of us, talked to some of our colleagues about that. Next slide, please. And this is Harry Telesco. He corroborated some of the Rowlett testimony, said that he knew about it as well. Next slide, please. Well, let's talk about the debunkers, because that's always something coming up. Carl Flock, Philip Klass. Now, interestingly, in 1997, I was invited to be on a program called Science Fiction, or SF Vortex, on the Sci-Fi Channel. Russ Estes, Carl Flock, and I were there. They brought us into L.A., into a hotel there, and they sent a car for us. And I only mention this because we're sitting in the back of the car, and we're going to this taping for this television show, and I suddenly realized Russ Estes had a background with the ASA, the Army Security Agency. Carl Flock had a background with the CIA, and I was former Air Force intelligence. We have all these intelligence connections going forward to talk about flying saucers on a television show. Carl, I've always believed, wanted to write a book about Roswell, but he came to the table too late. We'd already seen a lot of that stuff, so Carl went the other direction. He became a debunker on this. Next slide, please. I just thought you might want to get a better picture of Carl Flock. And you can see he's from New Mexico because he's wearing one of those stupid string ties with a big hunk of aquamarine turquoise. Thank you. I was actually going to say we'd do sort of a Socratic method here where you guys shout questions if you have them, but we won't do that. What Carl did was he didn't like the testimony of Frankie Rowe. And so Frankie Rowe's father had been with the fire department. So Carl Flock went to the fire department. He found some of the firemen. He said the Roswell Fire Department was not involved in the retrieval. He said he had interviewed 3 former firefighters who said, no, they didn't go out there. They had nothing to do with it. He talked to a former city councilman who said, no, they didn't let them make runs outside the city limits. I'd gone to the fire department and asked about that. And he said, well, what are you supposed to let it do, burn? Of course, we went outside the city limits. So his opinion was that Frankie Rowe tale was untrue. Next slide, please. Frankie Rowe's father is the fat guy at the end of the row of firemen there. So we know he was a firefighter. We got a picture of him in his firefighting outfit. He was also the local dog catcher for some reason. I don't know why. But as I said, they said that the Roswell Fire Department didn't make runs outside the city limits. Next slide, please. This is from the fire log. Unfortunately, there's no run out to the, we put out a fire near a flying saucer. But, I'm sorry, the next slide. This is from the fire record for June of 1947. And the top one actually says outside the city limits. So clearly they went outside the city limits. We can document it. So the city councilman who was on the city council in the 1950s really had no idea what they were doing back in 1947. Next slide. Frankie Rowe actually showed up after one of our lectures and was talking about how she'd had an opportunity, or she knew a little bit about this, told us some of the things that her father had told her, and that sort of thing. Next slide. So what we did was we found one of the firefighters, and we re-interviewed him, this fellow named J.D. Smith. He was like 904 years old at the time. We talked to him. Seemed to be very sharp, was a little annoyed that I had called him. And I was talking to him. He was giving me basically the same story that he'd given to Carl Flock. He said, no, we didn't go out there. We had no reason to go out there. None of our people went out there. And then I asked a question that apparently Carl hadn't asked. I said, well, do you know Dan Dwyer, Frankie Rowe's father? He says, oh, yeah, he went out there. I said, what? He said, yeah, what happened was his colonel came by to say we didn't need to head out to the crash site. I'm always wondering why it's always a colonel. Why it's never a captain, never a major, never a lieutenant. It's always a colonel. And let me tell you, colonels have more important things to do, like telling other people to do this stuff. But a colonel came by and said they didn't need to go out to the crash site because the Army had it covered. And he said, but Dan Dwyer did, went out in his private car. Said that Dan had seen the craft, seen the bodies. So what Smith had done was confirm Frankie Rowe's testimony. Their father had gone out and seen everything. And I'm wondering, Carl got the information that he wanted, which was the fire department wasn't involved, and then he didn't ask the next question. And I fear that goes on too often in UFO research. They don't ask the next question because they don't want to hear the answer. I always want to get the next question so when the skeptics say something to me, I can say, yeah, but I already asked that question. So Smith confirmed Frankie Rowe's testimony. Next slide, please. We had Bessie Brazel, which was the daughter of Mac, and she was interviewed, and she said, no, she was at the ranch at the time. She'd gone into Roswell with her father on the Sunday with the debris. He said nobody followed him back out. That Mac never went back into Roswell. He wasn't gone for a number of days because if he disappeared for a number of days, his wife would have been really annoyed at him. And she said that they picked up all the debris. It filled 4 burlap bags and they threw it under the porch. And that was the end of it. So the skeptics, of course, take the testimony of Bessie Brazel because it's what they want to hear. They don't say, well, if Mac Brazel didn't go back into Roswell, how did the Roswell Daily Record get pictures of him in Roswell? How do you have Major Edwin Easley say that Mac Brazel was held in the guest house for a number of days? You have Bill Brazel saying that he saw a story about his father in the newspaper. He went down to the ranch because he knew his father needed help, and his father was gone for 4 or 5 days before he came back. So you've got all these discrepancies. Next slide, please. Bill told us, of course, as I said, that Mac was alone. He said there was no evidence that she accompanied him to Roswell at the time. And the newspapers, as I said, proved that he did go back to Roswell. And the evidence suggests, and this is the evidence given by Jesse Marcel Sr., given by Bill Brazel, given by a number of other people, that there was a lot more debris than what she talked about being scattered on the field. Next slide, please. I was afraid of that. Couldn't quite read my little tiny screen here. Later on, Bessie Brazel, in talking to her brother, repudiated that early testimony and thought that she had the events mixed up with something else, that she wasn't really there. So the great debunker story collapses. These are fellows from the Roswell Hospital. And this Lorenzo Kimball put up a website that said that he was there at the time and none of this happened. It was all a crock. And he talked to Colonel Warney about this, and he said, no, it didn't happen. And Jack Comstock was there, and he said it didn't happen. And Kimball says, well, I was in a position to know because I was assigned to the hospital, and if anything had gone on the hospital, he would have known. And you get the impression he might have been a doctor from the way he talked about what was going on. He has since passed away, and I did get a nasty email from his son once. But what you have to remember, for those of you who've been in the military, or were in the military a long time ago as I was, that the base hospitals usually were made up of many, many buildings. Next slide, please. This is the last of the remnants of the base hospital at Roswell, and I think it's probably gone now. What we learned is the base hospital was made up of 9 or 10 or 12 buildings, and Kimball was assigned to one of the faraway ones, so he wouldn't have been in the position where he would have seen them bringing bodies or any of that sort of thing. And he wasn't a doctor, he was a medical supply officer. So if you've got some sort of activity going on at the base hospital that's classified, the last guy they're going to bring in is the guy who orders the medical supplies. So his story really doesn't hang together. And we run into these people who were there at the time, and I think because they were sort of cut out of the loop, they're very resentful of it, and they go out of their way to suggest nothing real happened there. Next slide, please. My favorite person, good old Sheridan Cavett. He was in charge of the counterintelligence in Roswell in 1947. When Don and I first saw him, he said he wasn't there. Yeah, he hadn't gotten to Roswell. Later he said, well, I was assigned to Roswell, but I hadn't arrived yet because I was on leave. And then it became, well, I was there, but I didn't go out to collect any balloons. In fact, he actually said that to us. He wouldn't have been involved in collecting any balloons or any of that nonsense. We were in his house in Sierra Vista, Arizona. I almost said New Mexico, Arizona. And we're talking to him, and I said something about the bodies, and it's the only time I ever saw him get nervous. He leaned forward, he picked up a magazine off the table, he sat back, he threw the magazine down, and he said, "Bill Rickett tell you that?" And I stupidly said, no, it was Major Edwin Easley, trying to protect Bill Rickett. And he relaxed, and I realized at that point I'd blown it. We could have gotten a lot more out of him. So anyway, Cavett says that there was no cordon up. They didn't go through checkpoints or any of that nonsense. When we were at his house in 1995, I think it was, he had just been interviewed by Colonel Richard Weaver of the Air Force investigation. And Weaver had asked him about going out to the debris field, and Cavett said he recognized it as a balloon the minute he saw it. The next question in the interview should have been, did you communicate this rather vital bit of intelligence to Jesse Marcel? But that's not the next question. They go off on something else. Cavett goes off on these tangents, and he says he wasn't there. We see him at his house weeks after Weaver had talked to him. I have him on tape. I said, there was a guy that went out with Marcel, good West Texas boy, knew how to ride horses, that sort of thing. And Cavett says, well, that sounds like me, but I wasn't there. He told Weaver he was. I mean, so we've got him on tape telling us a bald-faced lie. By the time we were there, he should have been able to give us the truth. Next slide, please. So this is what he said. Never picked up the balloons, never picked up the debris, was no guards, no barriers, all that sort of thing. Next slide, please. This is the one I was actually looking for. This is Bill Rickett. He said, yes, there were checkpoints. He did see the debris. He tried to pick it up. He couldn't get it to bend. He contradicted everything that Cavett said. And Don interviewed him at length. Don and Stan, I think, interviewed him. Mark Rodiger at the Center for UFO Studies interviewed him. So we've got a lot of what Rickett said. It contradicts exactly what Cavett said. Now, Cavett, of course, was the commander at the time of the CIC unit. Rickett was his NCOIC, which is the top sergeant in the shop. So we've got the two competing entities there saying different things. Cavett staying with what they want him to say. Next slide, please. So really where we are here, and I know Don likes to look at his picture, so I always try to throw a lot of them in there. And again, this explains why there's no picture of me with Bill Brazel. Actually, we do have one. So What we know is something crashed at Roswell in 1947. Everybody agrees on that. Everybody. Skeptics, debunkers, believers, researchers, everybody agrees something crashed. We believe it was extraterrestrial. We believe that based on the testimony of a great number of people who were there, a great number of people who were high-ranking, who were very credible, a great number of NCOs, a great number of enlisted people who were there, just as credible as anybody else, telling us that this happened. There are very few that say, no, what happened was this mogul balloon. We know it wasn't a mogul balloon because we can demonstrate there was no real flight number 4 to leave the debris. We checked all sorts of explanations, V-2 rockets, A-9 rockets, military aircraft, all that sort of thing. We couldn't find anything that would account for the debris. We're left with one avenue to follow, and that's the extraterrestrial. Edwin Easley told me that precisely. I said to him as we were talking one day, I said, are we following the right path? And Edwin Easley says, what do you mean? And I said, we think it was extraterrestrial. And he said, well, let me put it this way, it's not the wrong path. In essence, we were going down the right path when we moved to the extraterrestrial, and Easley was one of those who should have known. Thank you. And I believe I used up all my time. Are you oh, you're not next. This is why Stan is so much better than I am. This guy comes up and says, you want to mention your book? Well, yes, I have books. If you'd like to buy them and help me out, I would appreciate it. I always forget to mention my books, and there's my blog, kevinrandle.blogspot.com. I've got one posting up from here at this event, and I've got another one defending the Sirius movie with Stephen Greer, because I just am annoyed at much of the stuff that's been said about that since then. Again, thank you all very much. And don't applaud again. You're applauding my commercial, for God's sakes.
Are you offering the same discount as Stan? We'll applaud some more.
I had to pay almost full price for those darn things. Of course not.
Yours aren't discounted, which makes them more valuable.
Oh, there you go. Nick, are you next?
Yes, I am.
Am I eating into your time?
Yes, you are.
Well, then let me say, ha-ha on you. I'm going away, Nick, just as soon as I can get my computer picked up.